The Cummins N14 became a legend because it was reliable, powerful, and used everywhere. But there was another engine built in Germany that was more powerful, just as reliable, and absolutely nowhere to be found on American roads, despite being everything that truckers claimed they wanted. By the late 80s and into the 90s, American heavy trucking had largely settled on what it wanted from an engine, and Cummins was positioned perfectly to deliver it. This was not an era obsessed with novelty or experimentation. Fleets wanted predictability, uptime, and engines that could cross the country repeatedly without drama. Cummins did not just meet those expectations, it shaped them. The Cummins N14 arrived at a moment when fleets were transitioning away from older mechanical designs while still demanding the durability and serviceability they had come to expect from the big cam lineage. The N14 was not a radical break from the past. It felt familiar to mechanics, understandable to fleet managers, and safe to spec in large numbers. That familiarity mattered more than most spec sheet arguments ever could. At the time, American trucking placed enormous value on real-world reliability over theoretical performance. Horsepower numbers existed, but they were rarely the deciding factor on their own. What mattered more was whether an engine could pull consistently, handle abuse, and be repaired quickly almost anywhere in the country. Cummins had built an ecosystem around those needs. Parts were everywhere. Technicians knew the engines. Drivers trusted them. That trust became self-reinforcing. The N14 fit neatly into this environment. It offered strong power for long-haul work, predictable torque delivery, and a reputation for longevity when maintained properly. Fleets could spec it across multiple truck models and expect consistent results. That mattered more than chasing the highest possible output rating. In many cases, fleets intentionally avoided top-tier power options in favor of conservative, proven configurations that maximized engine life and reduced risk. In practice, most N14s were not ordered at the top of the rating chart. Common fleet configurations prioritize longevity over bragging rights, with outputs that balanced pulling power, fuel economy, and service life. These engines spent their lives in long-haul sleepers, regional freight, and heavy vocational trucks, where consistency mattered more than peak numbers. The appeal was not that the N14 was the most aggressive engine available, but that it delivered usable power across long distances without demanding constant attention. Fleets knew what an N14 would do at 80,000 pounds, day after day, and that predictability became part of its value. This period also coincided with a cultural preference for American-built solutions. Cummins was not just an engine supplier, it was part of the identity of American trucking. For many buyers, choosing Cummins felt like choosing the safe, responsible option. It was familiar, it was proven, and it was backed by a support network that no foreign manufacturer could match in the United States at the time. By the 1990s, the N14 had effectively become the reference point for American heavy trucking at the fleet level. Even as engines like Detroit Diesel's Series 60 and Caterpillar's 3406E competed hard for market share. Other engines were compared against it, not the other way around. That status created a powerful psychological barrier for competitors. Any alternative had to prove not only that it could match Cummins, but that it was worth abandoning a system that already worked. American fleets were also deeply shaped by geography. Long distances, variable terrain, and extreme operating conditions placed a premium on engines that could survive sustained use with minimal intervention. Cummins had decades of experience designing engines specifically for these realities. The N14 felt purpose-built for American roads, American loads, and American service practices. As a result, Cummins' position became entrenched. Dealers, service centers, and training programs all reinforced the dominance of the N14. New drivers learned on Cummins-powered trucks. New mechanics trained on Cummins platforms. The engine became part of the infrastructure of trucking itself, not just a component within it. By the time emissions regulations and electronic controls began reshaping engine design more aggressively, Cummins already held the advantage. The N14 was not just an engine, it was the default choice. Competing against that kind of inertia required more than strong specifications. It required a fundamental shift in how fleets thought about risk, support, and trust. That is the environment in which any true competitor must be evaluated, not against an idealized spec sheet, but against the reality of American trucking at the time. The Cummins N14 did not dominate because it was uncontested, it dominated because it fit the moment perfectly, and because American fleets saw no compelling reason to look elsewhere. That context matters because while Cummins was cementing its place in the United States, other manufacturers were solving the same problems in different ways elsewhere. Some of those engines were not experimental curiosities or niche designs. They were doing the same work day after day in equally demanding conditions. They simply did it outside the American spotlight. And one of those engines came from Germany. As Cummins refined the N14 for American fleets, MAN was continuing to evolve its own heavy-duty diesels to answer the same problem from a different starting point. The goal was not novelty or experimentation, it was the same challenge every heavy truck manufacturer faced in the late 20th century: how to move heavy loads over long distances, reliably day after day, without sacrificing durability or service life. MAN was not an outsider trying to force its way into trucking. It was a truck builder first, with engines designed specifically for long-haul and heavy vocational work. In that era, the backbone of MAN's heavy on-highway lineup was the D2866, a large displacement inline six developed to live under European cabs pulling weight across borders, mountains, and high-speed motorways year after year. It was not an industrial adaptation or a niche design. It was a core road truck engine, built for sustained use. MAN's approach to engine development reflected its broader position in the European trucking industry. As a manufacturer that built both trucks and engines in-house, MAN designed power plants as part of an integrated system rather than as standalone products. Cooling, driveline matching, transmission ratios, and long-term service intervals were considered from the start. That integration shaped how engines like the D2866 were developed, with less emphasis on modular compatibility across multiple brands and more emphasis on long-term durability within MAN's own trucks. The 2866 earned a reputation for balance, durability, and steady output rather than aggressive peak ratings. Like the Cummins N14, it reflected a conservative engineering philosophy that prioritized a strong bottom end, efficient combustion across a moderate RPM range, and the ability to deliver consistent performance without running at mechanical extremes. This was an engine meant to work continuously, not impress on paper. In practical terms, the 2866 occupied the same role as the N14. It was designed for long-haul trucking, heavy regional hauling, and demanding duty cycles where downtime was unacceptable. In Europe, MAN-powered trucks were doing the same kind of work American fleets expected from Cummins-powered rigs, just under different regulatory and cultural conditions. European long-haul trucking placed its own pressures on engines like the 2866. Trucks routinely crossed national borders, climbed sustained grades, and ran at highway speeds for extended periods under tight delivery schedules. Downtime carried the same penalties it did in the United States, and fleet operators expected engines to survive high utilization without constant intervention. In that environment, reliability was not a marketing claim. It was an operational requirement, and MAN designed its engines accordingly. Where the comparison becomes interesting is within the inline-six class itself. In higher output configurations, the 2866 delivered power and torque figures comparable to many common fleet-spec N14 ratings. This was not about chasing extreme numbers, but about sustained output in the same long-haul role. MAN achieved this within the same inline-six architecture, without specialty tuning or experimental layouts, and with the same expectation of durability under continuous load. Just as important was how that power was delivered. MAN engines were known for strong mid-range pull and steady torque, characteristics that mattered far more than peak ratings when climbing grades or running heavy at speed. This made them well-suited to European long-haul routes, which demanded both endurance and usable power rather than short bursts of performance. Reliability was not an afterthought. MAN engines earned a reputation for long service life when maintained properly, particularly in fleet environments that followed disciplined service schedules. The idea that a foreign engine could match the durability of a Cummins often clashes with American assumptions. But in practice, the 2866 was expected to work hard for years, and it did. The difference was not capability, but context. European fleets operated within tighter regulatory frameworks and higher fuel costs, which encouraged efficient, well-engineered designs. MAN responded with engines that balanced power, efficiency, and longevity. On paper and in service, the 2866 could stand shoulder to shoulder with the N14 in the same role. From a purely functional standpoint, there was nothing about the 2866 that disqualified it from American roads. It was not too small, too specialized, or too experimental. It fit under truck cabs, pulled heavy loads, and accumulated mileage the same way American engines did. If judged only by what it was designed to do, it belonged in the same conversation. Yet despite this, MAN engines remained almost invisible in the United States. Outside of industrial and marine niches, they were not widely marketed or supported by a dense dealer network. And they were not trusted by fleets accustomed to calling a Cummins distributor in every major city. Capability alone was not enough to overcome those barriers. This is where the comparison becomes most revealing. The MAN D2866 was not passed over because it was incapable. It was passed over because adopting it meant leaving behind a system that already functioned seamlessly. In an industry built on margins and uptime, that kind of change demanded a compelling reason. And for American fleets in that era, no matter how capable the engine, that reason never arrived. The reason MAN never gained a foothold in the United States had very little to do with the capabilities of the 2866, but more to do with what American fleets were unwilling to risk. By the time the 2866 was proving itself across Europe, the American trucking industry had already built a complete ecosystem around Cummins, and that ecosystem was almost impossible for an outsider to penetrate. Service infrastructure was the biggest wall. Cummins did not just sell engines, it sold nationwide coverage. Dealers, parts counters, rebuild shops, and trained technicians were spread across the country. A breakdown in rural Nebraska or western Arizona was a delay, not a logistical nightmare. Fleets spec'd Cummins because they could predict the recovery plan before the truck even rolled into a shoulder. That certainty was baked into purchasing decisions. MAN couldn't offer anything close to that in the US. Even if the 2866 was durable, fleets still had to ask the questions that decide everything in trucking. Where do parts come from on short notice? Who stocks injectors, sensors, and hard parts across multiple states? Who has the tooling and experience when the engine starts acting up under load? How long does the truck sit if a component has to come from overseas or through a thin domestic channel? None of that is about brand perception. It is about whether the truck earns money this week. Diagnostics and support culture mattered too. In the 90s, fleets were already standardizing training and procedures around the engines they ran in volume. Cummins had the documentation, the training pipeline, and the institutional knowledge. A foreign engine meant retraining technicians, changing troubleshooting habits, and building a new mental library from scratch. That is expensive even when it goes smoothly, and it rarely goes smoothly at first. When uptime is the entire game, fleets avoid the learning curve unless the payoff is undeniable. Then there is the OEM reality. Most fleets do not buy engines in isolation. They buy trucks. Truck manufacturers design cooling packages, wiring, mounts, gearing recommendations, and service procedures around engines they expect to sell in volume. Cummins fit neatly into those packages. A 2866 option would have required engineering work, validation miles, parts warehousing, dealer training, and long-term support commitments. Without major fleet demand, OEMs had no incentive to spend that money. And without OEM offerings, fleets had no easy, factory-supported way to spec the engine at scale. That creates a closed loop. It is rarely offered, so it is rarely ordered, so it remains rarely offered. Resale value and financing quietly reinforce the same loop. In the US, a Cummins-powered truck was easier to price, easier to sell, and easier to place back into service. Buyers in the secondary market knew what they were looking at, and they knew they could get it fixed almost anywhere. A rare foreign engine might have been interesting, but interesting is not a line item that improves residuals. Fleets noticed that, banks noticed it too, even drivers noticed it because they tend to avoid trucks that turn a simple breakdown into a parts scavenger hunt. Cultural preference did play a role, but it was downstream of the business case. Buy American sounds like emotion, yet in trucking it often translates into practical concerns. Parts availability, shop familiarity, and how fast a truck returns to the road. The German engine did not have to be bad to be rejected, it only had to be uncertain. And that's the point most people miss. The 2866 was not passed over because it couldn't handle American-style work, but because adopting it required stepping outside a system that already worked, and the benefits were not large enough to justify the operational risk. In the American trucking market of that era, Cummins provided certainty, and certainty usually won.